Resuming debate, the honourable member for Brandon Souris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I begin the debate on an issue that is near and dear to the hearts of many Canadians, and that in particular my dear friend and colleague, the honourable member from Malpeque, to officially recognize in law the Charlottetown, or that Charlottetown was indeed the birthplace of Canadian Confederation. Not only is this legislation 150 years old, or 150 years too late, pardon me, Mr. Speaker, but it finally solves the great debate on where in Canada should be formally recognized as our official birthplace. Secondly, this legislation will unofficially give the blessing of the Parliament of Canada for proclaiming that their province, Prince Edward Island, is in fact the birthplace of Confederation on their license plates. I commend the tenacity of Islanders in their struggle to get this endorsed recognition, and as the old saying goes, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. And I wouldn't be surprised to find out that this saying is in fact inscribed on the member of Malpeque's family crest. Now, as only a Canadian squabble among provinces can break out, from what I am led to believe, our New Brunswick brethren decided that their Canada 150 celebration or tourism slogan declared that people should visit their province to, quote, celebrate where it all began, end quote. This impasse on which province should officially be designated by law led to S-236 being introduced by Senator Griffin from PEI so that our dear friends from the New Brunswick delegation would know that the seed planted, which led to the birth of our great country, was done so in September of 1864 while on the island of the Great Red Mud. In preparation for this momentous debate, my office reached out to the Parliamentary Library and requested the book The Road to Confederation, written by Donald Creighton, which some would call the most preeminent tome ever written on the subject. And lo and behold, their copy had walked away. Well, some would raise suspicions on whether the Minister of Tourism from New Brunswick somehow acquired this book as to ensure that the waters remain muddy on this age-old question. But as it were to be like divine intervention, the Parliamentary Library found its original 1964 hardback copy at the 13th hour and saved the day. The very concept of a united Canada in 1864 was as far-fetched as the idea that this current Liberal government will inevitably balance their budget. Saying that, hope springs eternal. Canada was created, so therefore there is a slight and minute chance that the current federal ledgers may one day return to being written in the black. Today's debate is to prove that Charlottetown should be recognized as the birthplace of Confederation, and to do so, I will rely on the evidence found in Donald Creighton's book, which goes through great pains to illustrate that without the Charlottetown Conference, we would not have been celebrating our sesquicentennial. As it has been said, the Charlottetown Conference was originally not designed or orchestrated for the sole purpose of unifying the various regions of British North America under one central government. The intent of the meeting was to explore whether Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia could amalgamate as one entity. Well, it would be an understatement to say there was hesitancy from these three colonies to undergo maritime union. It was none other than Sir John A., George Etienne Cartier, George Brown, and Alexander Galt who struck when the iron was hot. While the province of Canada and the three maritime colonies may have been neighbours, their direct links and familiarity were nowhere near as strong as they would soon become. While the delegates from the maritime colonies had arrived in preparation for the conference, PEI's W.H. Hope, the provincial secretary, who had been tapped to be the official welcoming party, wondered where the interlopers from the west were. It was not until the next morning, on the 1st of September, in which an unknown steamer pulled into view. As was noted in the Road to Confederation, the Islanders later came to call her the Confederate cruiser. As soon as the ship pulled into the harbor, the news traveled as fast as a prairie wildfire. The Canadians have arrived. Now, much to the chagrin of Pope, the cruiser didn't actually dock in the harbor, but it anchored some distance from the wharf. How was he supposed to extend only the most personable and warm Islander welcome, as only an Islander can do, without being in the presence of these Canadians. He found himself a rowboat, and according to the New Brunswick Assembly journals, he started bravely out with all the dignity he could in a flat-bottom boat with a barrel of flour in the bow and 2 jars of molasses in the stern, and with a lusty fisherman as his only companion to meet the distinguished visitors. As the Canadians assembled on shore and met in the Legislative Council chamber in the Colonial Building, the Prince Edward Island government was taken back by such a large delegation. They'd only prepared a table to sit 4 delegates from the West. However, sitting across from them was a group of 8 smiling Canadian ministers, and in tow, the clerk of the Canadian Executive Council and 2 of Sir John A.'s secretaries. To highlight the excitement that was in the air, well, as a stroke of coincidence, the Slaymaker and Nichols Olympic Circus was in town. Now, why, one might ask, did I bring this up? I do so because Islanders from across the colony had gathered in Charlottetown to attend the circus, the first in over 2 decades. So there was no room available at any of the hotels or lodgings to accommodate all of the Canadian delegation. Because all the accommodations were accounted for, this provided for a far more personal interaction between none other than George Brown, who was invited to stay at the affable W.H. Pope's house, while others were put up at Franklin House. As they began the heavy work of negotiating a single unified country, P.B. Waite wrote in the Life and Times of Confederation, the Charlottetown Conference established Confederation as a political reality. It gave Confederation the official élan, the sense of common destiny. It was that morning where the 4 principals, Macdonald, Cartier, Brown, and Galt, began the process of gently swaying their maritime cohorts. The Canadians who were once bitter enemies, in particular Macdonald and Brown, had decided to holster their partisan leanings and personal political objectives in order to persuade the others that Confederation was, quote, possible, desirable, and even necessary. And day 3 of the conference proceeded in the same orderly fashion, with rhetorical flourishes and convincing arguments by the other Canadian delegates, who were doing an extraordinary job of convincing all those who attended the great potential of a united Canada. And it was that night that the Canadians invited the Maritimers on board the Queen Victoria, aka the Confederate cruiser, and swooned them over a decadent meal and a steady flow of Sir John A.'s water. The ice had been broken. The relationships were now firmly formed, and no longer were they strangers or even acquaintances. They were the architects of Canada. And according to George Brown's letter to his wife, recalling the events of the evening, someone had yelled on the vessel, if anyone can show just cause or impediment why the colony should not be united in matrimonial alliance, let him now express it or forever hold his peace. To the surprise of no one, there was silence. And George Brown said, quote, the union was thereupon formally completed and proclaimed, end quote. Confederation was meant to be. And that very word, confederation, which only 2 days before was as foreign to the delegates as the word excitable to describe Stephen Harper, or the word humility as to the current sitting Prime Minister, was now dripping from the tongues of with great excitement from those who had gathered around the mahogany table the next day at the Colonial Building in Charlottetown. Mr. Speaker, I think the evidence provided by my colleagues in previous speeches and some of the color I was able to provide has helped convince this House that S-236 should be passed with unanimity and expediency. Well, the Charlottetown Conference was just one element that led to the official creation of our Dominion in 1867. It was the birthplace which led to the successful Quebec City and London conferences. As P.B. Waite said, quote, what was surprising was not as much what was concluded at Quebec, but how much had been arranged at Charlottetown. And to Donald Creighton, who wrote that people despairingly said that nothing could ever happen in Charlottetown, they have undeniably been proven wrong. And the story of how our nation was created, of Westerners, Maritimers, and yes, even Islanders, could put aside petty differences to focus on what was best for the greater good, is a lesson 150 years later to all of us assembled here today. It perhaps could lead to great compromises among all political parties in 2017 if only the member from Malpak could row out in his dinghy and show us that true Islander hospitality for which they are known. There is more that unites Canadians than divides us. That the nation is unified and proud, Mr. Speaker. And as we gaze upon what the next 150 years will bring, we pay tribute to those courageous founding fathers for all that they did, and we make the solemn pledge to pass down a stronger Canada than the one that we inherited. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.